I was signing away my inheritance when my sister-in-law's slap exposed my mother-in-law's secret. And the worst part is, I almost let it happen without a fight. My hand was already on the pen. The lawyer's office in Halifax smelled like fresh coffee and old paper, and the wind off the harbor kept rattling the window behind me like it wanted me to stop. I didn't stop. I told myself this was the mature thing to do. My name doesn't matter as much as what I learned that afternoon. But I'll tell you anyway. I was 31, a high school teacher, and I had been married to my husband for 6 years. We met in our second year of university in Wolfville, both broke, both living off craft dinner and bad coffee, and somehow we built a real life together. A semi-detached house in Dartmouth, a dog named Biscuit. A marriage I thought was steady, the kind that doesn't make headlines, because nothing ever goes wrong. That afternoon, I was sitting in a lawyer's office because my father-in-law had passed away 8 months earlier, and the family was finally getting around to settling his estate. He'd owned a small but successful marina and boat repair business on the South Shore, the kind of place that had been in the family for 3 generations, and according to the original, Will, my husband and I were supposed to inherit a 20% stake in it, plus a small parcel of waterfront property his father had specifically left to my son and his wife together. But sitting across the table from me that day, with my husband beside me looking at his shoes, was a new document, a waiver. My husband's mother had brought it in 3 weeks earlier, claiming there had been a clerical error in the original will, and that the waterfront property and the business shares should have gone solely to her son, not to the marriage, as she kept putting it. She'd hired her own lawyer. She'd had the paperwork drawn up fast, the way people move when they don't want you to think too hard about what you're agreeing to. My husband Ryan, I'll just call him that, it fits, had started pulling away from me almost the moment his father died. At first I told myself it was grief. Of course it was grief. His dad had taught him to tie knots and gut fish and back a boat trailer down a ramp without jackknifing it. And now that was gone. I gave him space. I made him tea. He didn't drink, and dinners he picked at. I told him I loved him and that we'd get through it together, and he'd nod and say, "Yeah, I know," in a voice that sounded like he was reading off a cue card. Then the calls from his mother started. Always when I wasn't in the room. Always ending the second I walked in. I'd ask him what was going on, and he'd say, "Nothing. Just sorting out dad's stuff." And that word, nothing, became a wall I couldn't get over no matter how many times I knocked on it. 3 months earlier, he started talking about simplifying things. About how maybe it wasn't fair for me to have a claim on a family business I never worked at. About how his mother was going through a hard time, and we shouldn't make this complicated for her. I remember standing in our kitchen, dish towel still in my hand, asking him point blank, "Are you trying to cut me out of this?" And he looked at me, really looked at me for the first time in weeks and said, "It's not about cutting you out.
It's about keeping the peace."
Keeping the peace. I've thought about that phrase more times than I can count since then, because I've come to understand that keeping the peace is often just another way of saying somebody decided your feelings were less important than someone else's comfort. So there I was, 8 months after his father's funeral, sitting in a conference room on Hollis Street, with my husband's family lawyer sliding a waiver across a polished table, watching my husband stare at a spot on the wall just past my shoulder, refusing to meet my eyes. His mother sat at the head of the table in a cream blazer, perfectly composed, the way she always was, hands folded like she was at church. "It's just a formality," she said, when she caught me hesitating. "Your father-in-law would have wanted this cleaned up properly. You understand, don't you, dear?" She always called me dear, right before she asked me to give something up. The lawyer cleared his throat and slid the pen a half-inch closer to me. "Once you sign, the estate can be finalized and distributed according to the amended terms." My throat went tight. 20% of a business that had taken 3 generations to build. A piece of waterfront land my father-in-law had stood on with me exactly once, the summer Ryan and I got engaged, when he'd put his hand on my shoulder and said, half joking, half not, This'll be yours and Ryan's someday. Don't let anybody talk you out of it. I looked at my husband. Ryan, I said quietly, is this really what you want? He didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was flat, rehearsed, like he'd practiced the line in the car. Let's not make this harder than it needs to be. Harder. I'd given up a Saturday morning of marking essays to sit in this office. I'd put on real clothes instead of the leggings I usually wore around the house since his dad died. I was trying, and he was talking to me like I was the inconvenience. I picked up the pen. My fingers actually closed around it. I told myself, the way you do when you're exhausted and out of fight, that maybe this was just how families worked sometimes. Maybe some things weren't worth the conflict. Maybe I should just sign and we could move forward and I could stop feeling like a stranger in my own marriage. That's when the door opened so hard, it cracked against the wall. Everyone in the room turned. My husband's younger sister stood in the doorway, still in her scrub top from the hospital where she worked as a nurse, her face white with something that wasn't quite anger yet, but was about to become it. I'd always liked her. She was the one who'd helped me pick my wedding dress, the one who texted me memes during boring family dinners. We weren't close, but there was something honest about her that I'd always trusted more than I trusted most of this family. Don't, she said. Don't sign that. Ryan stood up so fast his chair scraped. Sloan, what are you doing here? This isn't. It's exactly my business, she said, walking into the room like she owned it, eyes locked not on her brother but on her mother. I just came from the storage unit on Bedford Highway. Dad's storage unit. The one you told me was already cleared out. Her mother's composure didn't crack, not exactly, but something behind her eyes went very still and very cold, the way water gets right before it freezes. Sloan, this isn't the place, she said. It's exactly the place. Sloane's hands were shaking, but her voice wasn't. I found Dad's real files, the accountant's files, the ones from before you helped him organize his paperwork last year. The lawyer set down his pen. The room had gone so quiet I could hear the radiator ticking in the corner. Mom altered the will, Sloan said, turning now to face the table, to face all of us. Not a clerical error. She had it redone 6 months before Dad died, when he was already on heavy pain medication for his back, and she didn't tell either of you because she knew you'd never have agreed to it if Dad was thinking clearly. That is a vicious thing to say about your own mother, her mother said, finally rising from her chair, voice sharp now, all the cream blazer softness gone. And that's when it happened. Sloan crossed the room in 3 steps and slapped her mother across the face, the sound cracking through that quiet office like a dropped plate. Nobody moved. I don't think anybody breathed. Ryan's mouth was open, but nothing was coming out. The lawyer half rose out of his chair, like he wasn't sure if he should call security or just sit back down. Sloane's hand was still raised, like she couldn't quite believe what she'd done either. Her mother pressed a palm to her cheek, eyes wide, and for the first time in 6 years of knowing this woman, I saw something other than control on her face. I saw fear. You knew, Sloan said, her voice cracking now, the anger finally breaking into something rawer. You knew Dad wanted us to have that land and those shares together, and you let Ryan believe it was about fairness, so he wouldn't ask too many questions. You used his grief. I was protecting this family, her mother said, but it came out thin. You were protecting yourself, Sloan said, because you'd already taken a second mortgage out against the business 18 months ago without telling anyone. And if her name, she pointed at me, stayed on that property as joint owner, the bank could have come after it. You needed the waiver signed before anyone found out what you'd done with the company's finances. I sat there with the pen still in my hand, feeling the room tilt sideways around me. I looked at Ryan. Did you know about this? He shook his head slowly, and for once I believed him, because the look on his face wasn't guilt. It was the particular shock of someone realizing the person he trusted most had been lying to him for over a year. Mom, what is she talking about? What second mortgage? His mother sat back down heavily, like her legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold her up. The lawyer was already reaching for the phone, presumably to call whoever needed calling, when a will turns out to have been forged under undue influence on a dying man. "I never meant for it to get this far," his mother said quietly. And for the first time, she looked old to me, smaller than the woman who'd called me dear 20 minutes earlier. The business was struggling after the slip refurbishment 2 years ago. I borrowed against it to keep it afloat, told myself I'd pay it back before anyone noticed. Then your father got sick and I panicked, and I thought if I could just keep full control of the property, I could sell off part of the marina quietly and cover it before the bank came calling. "You let Dad die thinking he'd taken care of us," Ryan said, and his voice broke on the word dad in a way that undid me more than anything else that had happened in that room. "I told him you'd be fine," she said. "I told him I'd make sure you'd be fine. By cutting my wife out of what he wanted her to have?" His mother didn't answer that one. She just looked down at her hands. The lawyer, to his credit, handled it the way a good lawyer should. Calmly, clearly, without drama. He explained that given what had just been disclosed, in this room, on the record, with witnesses, the waiver could not be processed, and frankly, the amended will itself would now have to be reviewed for validity. Given the credible allegation of undue influence and the timing relative to her husband's medical condition. He suggested gently that everyone needed separate legal counsel before another word was said. I put the pen down. My hand was shaking, but not from fear anymore. From relief, mostly, and a strange kind of grief for a version of that afternoon where I'd just quietly signed and never found out any of this. We left the office in 3 separate cars. Sloan drove me home because Ryan needed, in his words, an hour to not be in the same vehicle as anyone right now, and I understood that completely. She didn't say much on the drive, just reached over once at a red light and squeezed my hand and said, "I should have come forward sooner. I found the files 2 weeks ago. I kept telling myself I needed more proof before I said anything and almost let you sign it anyway. I'm sorry." "You came forward in time," I told her. "That's what matters." It took 4 more months to untangle everything properly. A forensic accountant got involved. The amended will was set aside by the court once it was clear it had been executed while my father-in-law was on medication. Strong enough to affect his judgment, witnessed only by people connected to his wife, and never reviewed by his own longtime lawyer, who hadn't even known it existed until the estate paperwork came across his desk. The original will stood. Ryan and I did, eventually, receive the 20% stake, and the waterfront parcel his father had wanted us to have, jointly, the way he'd written it down with his own hand, years before any of this started. His mother avoided criminal charges. In the end, mostly because Ryan and Sloan didn't want to drag their father's name through a courtroom, and a forensic accountant's report, any more than necessary, and because she agreed to a settlement that covered what she owed and removed her from any further control of the business. But something between her and her children broke that day that I don't think will ever fully mend. She moved to a condo in Lunenburg a year later. Ryan calls her on her birthday. That's about the extent of it now. As for Ryan and me, I won't pretend it was simple after that. I was angry for a long time, not really at him, but at how easily he'd been willing to let me lose something, because his mother told him it would keep the peace. We went to counseling, the unglamorous kind, in a strip mall office above a dry cleaner's, every second Tuesday for almost a year. He apologized more times than I could count, and somewhere around month 6, I started actually believing him, instead of just hearing the words. I should have asked more questions. He told me once, sitting on our back steps with Biscuit asleep between us. I let her convince me that protecting the family meant going along with whatever she said. I almost lost you over it. You didn't lose me, I said, but you came close enough that I think about it. He nodded. He didn't argue, which I respected more than any apology he could have given. We kept the waterfront property. We never sold the shares in the marina. Some weekends now we drive down to the South Shore and just sit on that little strip of land. His father once stood on with his hand on my shoulder, telling me not to let anyone talk me out of it. I think about that a lot. How he must have known, even then, what his wife might try to do, and how he tried, in his own quiet way, to protect me before he was even gone. The slap in that lawyer's office is the part people probably remember when I tell this story, the shocking part, the part that makes people go quiet when I get to it. But it wasn't the slap that saved us. It was Sloane walking through that door 2 weeks earlier than she'd planned to. Before I could put my name on a piece of paper that would have erased the truth for good. The truth was already sitting in a storage lease unit on Bedford Highway, waiting. All it needed was someone brave enough to go looking for it before it was too late.